I got 3 words for you. Magazines, Britain, 19th century. Now you may be saying to yourself, Townsend, what could be worse than that? All right, you think you're clever? How about when the astronauts of the Challenger space shuttle crashed to Earth and died? Okay, that was probably much worse. Shame on you. But in all seriousness, today we are talking about science in the 19th century periodical. It is an incredibly fascinating topic and one with a ton of depth. To accomplish this, I'm going to give a review and synopsis of Cantor et al.'s book, Science in the 19th Century Periodical, Reading the Book of Nature. Hold on a second, I think I have my copy of it somewhere here. Boom, baby. Hope you can see it. As an overview of 19th century British science, because let's be real, you need one. You're a pleb, a peon. You have no idea about British science because you spend your time learning how to do useful things, like paying taxes or bills or getting a job, and not careening your way towards poverty and sadness like I am. Well, if that's the case, you're going to need a rule of thumb for how British science developed as a useful guide through this video. There's 3 main stages. In general, the early 19th century was characterized by gentlemen of science. These were typically men of independent incomes who used science as a hobby to better understand nature and God. Some typical examples of this are astronomer Joseph Herschel. That's not his name. Astronomer John Herschel, geologist Roderick Murchison, or botanist Joseph Banks. The story goes that as the 19th century progressed, science went from a bunch of rich guys doing it for a lark to a group of younger, professionally trained men who did science for a living, closer to what we would understand science to be today. But just how accurate is that story, and where do the periodicals come into play? To answer this question, let's look to Cantor et al.'s thesis in the introduction of his book. On page 2, it reads, "The object of this collection of essays is to analyze the representation of science, technology, and medicine, as well as the interpenetration of science and literature in the general periodical press in 19th century Britain. The following chapters address not only the reception of scientific ideas in the general press, but also examine the creation of non-specialist forms of scientific discourse within periodical formats, and the ways in which they interacted with the assortment of other kinds of articles found in 19th century periodicals." As a thesis, this is interesting, but why is it needed, and how is it different from previous scholarship? A large part of the introduction is responding to and differentiating itself from Robert Young's famous, you got to put the famous in air quotes, because in the history of science, how much is really that famous? The thesis is that for the first 8 decades of the 19th century, British periodical literature represented a common intellectual context where all the sciences were integrated together. And then after the 1880s, periodical literature fractured into specialist disciplines, which professionalized science and in effect locked out some people from participating in science. However, Cantor et al. Point out that Young's thesis has some serious issues. The first issue is that this common intellectual context, then transitioning into professionalized science, is a problem because it presents a progressivist history which loses any nuance in the changing notions of literary or scientific that were happening during the time period. Woo! Tune out. Egghead discussion alert. Pay attention now, this is important. Now, you may have never heard the words progressivist history before, but why is it a problem? Well, it's closely tied to the term Whig history. The term was first coined by Herbert Butterfield in 1931, referring to old histories of Britain that basically went something like this. The signing of the Magna Carta. That's not a good British accent. Let me work on it. Hello. The signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 led to the Enlightenment, which means that as everybody got smarter, society got better, and therefore the signing of the Magna Carta led to the creation of the Whig Party. Pretty good, I know. The problem is history doesn't lead anywhere. Full stop. Now, what does that mean? Society isn't always getting better, and if we assume that it is, we lose out on the nuance in historical analysis from looking at where things could have gone another way. To be very clear, this isn't some postmodern, there is no truth, or everything is right type of view. When you do a progressivist or Whig history, events don't make causal sense in the way that they are described. Let's take, for example, if I were to do a progressivist history of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I might say something like this. Tony Stark was hit by a missile in the Middle East, which led to the creation of the Avengers, making the world a safer place. Eventually, the Avengers went on to defeat Thanos, even saving the universe. But if I do that, I lose the ability to do any useful Marvel Cinematic Universe history. For one, it just doesn't make sense to say that Tony Stark getting hit by a missile led to the creation of the Avengers. It just doesn't. Even if timeline-wise, that was the first thing to happen in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and all things are connected causally. Hear me out. Instead of saying that Tony Stark getting hit by a missile led to the creation of the Avengers, it makes much more sense to say that the Avengers were created by Nick Fury when he needed a team to address the Tesseract being stolen by Loki. Second, saying the world got safer doesn't make any sense either, since Tony Stark literally created a robot that almost destroyed the world. This is why, after World War I, progressivist histories were re-examined and rejected by many historians, because maybe, after an event called the Great War, the world wasn't just improving or becoming a safer place. Okay, you can finally count that egghead alert over. So, the other problem is it isn't clear how much of a common intellectual context there actually was and how much it was fractured in the 1880s and beyond. Cantor et al. Seem to think that while there was some common intellectual context for science, the amount that periodicals changed and interplayed with science in the period before 1880 was significant. Lastly, let's talk about what changed for periodical literature throughout the 19th century. Very, very broadly speaking, the amount of periodicals increased tremendously due to a number of different factors. For one, in the unpredictable markets of the 19th century, periodicals allowed publishers to form relationships with different groups of readers without risking the large capital investment that a book production required. Another thing was that most people of the time period couldn't afford proper books, but periodical literature allowed working and middle-class people to participate in literary and scientific culture through reprints from books that would often appear in the periodicals themselves. Another, and maybe one of the most important factors in the huge periodical growth throughout this time period, was that periodicals just got cheaper. There were advances in printing technology, which allowed people to sell periodicals for much cheaper prices. Periodicals from this time period have also been traced by some historians to the creation of what they call mass culture, which basically means that if you weren't reading the periodicals, you were missing out on what everybody else was doing. Science was impacted by periodicals in the 19th century in the following very, 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 very general ways. So just these are rules of thumb and useful ways to think about, but as we go through different essays in this book and different videos, you'll see that what I'm about to say isn't always the case. In the early years of the 19th century, gentlemen of science, like the ones we talked about earlier, used periodical literature as an important platform for addressing a non-specialist but culturally powerful audience. Early on, science writing in periodicals was aimed at non-specialist elites. It was a kind of performance by these gentlemen of science, which would have been analogous to a similar type of performance they would have been expected to give in, say, a fashionable salon to another noble person. Towards the middle of the 19th century is when periodical growth absolutely exploded. This was due to a growing middle class and increases in literacy rates across the board. It was also bolstered by a growing network of railroads across Britain, which meant that periodicals could be distributed for cheaper, meaning that more people would be able to read them. During this time period, science in periodicals was also seen as a rational source of enlightenment and entertainment. Better that little Bobby learn how to grow plants or something than go try to worship the devil with those anti-Christian magazines. Scientists themselves during mid-century used writing opportunities in periodicals both to increase their professional authority as well as create a body of works that others could draw off of. Finally, by the late 19th century, science intersected with periodicals in two key ways. The first is that, as Young's thesis said, new specialist journals started appearing, which in some ways did lock the public out from participating. At the same time, though, new journalistic methods of presenting science also appeared. These invited the lay public to perform and present their own scientific experiments, which directly challenged the scientific authority that scientists of the mid-century had worked to garner. As a result of this, the line between popular and elite science was considerably blurred. To wrap up this video, I'm going to give it a 4 angry David Brewsters out of 5. The introduction sets up the remainder of the book well and gives readers a heads up of what they should be looking out for in the other essays in the rest of the collection. The only negatives I had for it was that it was a little bit dry. And now you may be saying, oh, boo-hoo, you're reading a specialist textbook and you want more flavor and you don't want it to be quite so boring. Yes, that is exactly my answer. In fact, I would like it to be less boring, despite all of those things. To be less comical and more constructive with my review, here's why I thought it was a little bit dry. There was a lot of, here are some arguments historians made. Here's how we're drawing on their arguments, and here's how we're a little bit different, sort of repeatedly. Which I get is the point of an introduction to a history collection. I've just seen it done a little bit better before. Thanks for watching. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe. It helps a lot. And that way I can make big YouTuber money and make my own reality TV show, The Fellows of the Royal Society, instead of this peon book review garbage. Thanks.